Hello and welcome to Newsroom's latest episode of Raw Politics. This is our weekly visual and audio chat about all things politics. I have here with me today Newsroom's Foreign Affairs Editor, Sam Sachdeva. Hello.
Thank you.
And we also have Tim Murphy, Newsroom's co-founder editor. How are you, Tim?
I'm good, thank you guys.
And I am Newsroom's political editor, Jo Moir. So each week with this, we're going to dissect, discuss and sort of debate some of the political topics that have been going on, and we'll also be getting a couple of reader questions each week from our lovely Newsroom Pro readers who want to know a little bit more about a certain topic that they've had on their mind. So in terms of this week, we're going to look at that policy purge that took place on Monday, the second bonfire of Chris Hipkins, so to speak. And we will also have a bit of a chat about the outgoing, well, not even outgoing, the Gonberger Police Minister, Stuart Nash, who has obviously lost that portfolio this week, and talk about what the future might hold for him. So let's get started. I think good starting point. Policy purge has obviously happened. Sam, do you want to just, for our watchers and listeners, explain a little bit about what policies actually got dropped, I guess, on Monday with that announcement?
Absolutely. It turns out that policy bonfires are not good for the climate. Who knew? So a lot of climate projects got the chop. The big one, the biggest price tag is this Clean Car Upgrade Scheme is the technical name. You might know it as Cash for Clunkers, was the idea where you trade in sort of higher emitting vehicles and you get money to go towards something that's a little bit more environmentally friendly, or public transport. That's gone altogether. They decided it's sort of too hard. They've also cut back the plans for a social leasing car scheme. The idea that you could, again, help lower income families get better cars in terms of environmental impact. And then we have lost a few other things as well that are less environmentally related. The speed limit program has been cut back quite dramatically. They were going to reduce speed limits in a lot of the country, and now they're just focusing.
Everyone can still drive fast.
Yep, don't worry, Jo. Your diesel car will be hooning everywhere, apart from Wellington. And then we've also seen them get rid of the second part of alcohol law reforms, which is around alcohol sponsorship and advertising, how that works. So some people not happy with that because I think it's an area where there are quite a few concerns. And, hard to keep up with everything. They've also getting rid of plans to lower the voting age to 16 for general elections. They are going to look at it for council elections, but not the big thing. And then we've also seen them get rid of plans to look at the definition of contractors, which Newsroom covered this week. So
really, really good story there from Rebecca McPhee. If people want to go have a look at that. That is a lot of stuff. I think it's a good sort of place to start, Tim. The green stuff, the environmental stuff. Basically anything the Green Party likes, and actually you could add into that the voting age stuff and the alcohol harm stuff as well, which is very Green Party policies too. All gone. What does this say, I guess, about the direction that Chris Hipkins is, taking the government, and what does it say for the relationship with the Green Party?
Yeah, it was a bonfire of the virtue signalling, wasn't it, really? And virtue has plainly just had its time. My view is he deliberately provoked and wants to provoke things green and the Green Party. He's expecting their reaction. He and his advisors will be thinking, well, that's fine. They'll oppose this and that'll help us in the next 6 months among the centrist voters they want. And in his broader political play, I think that the upside of what Sam was listing at what they've done, what they're going to spend some of this money on by, increasing superannuation payments and welfare payments and student loan payments and so on. The upside of that is that they're thinking that they don't care what the Jo Moyers and the Sam Sachdevas write so soundly, and I think correctly, about cynicism and about political calculation of setting aside green issues and climate issues. All they care about are those people who are going to get a bit more money and will judge this administration, the Hipkins administration, better.
It has cleared the decks massively, and this has been about getting rid of any distractions, really, isn't
it? Yeah, and they have clearly, I'm just going to use this to rant about something I've been ranting about all week, bread and butter issues. We've heard it a million times. If I hear it a million more for the election, I will tear what's left of my hair out. So they've clearly focused tested it. They know that's what people want to hear. So it's just let's keep it very, very basic and focus on that. So, yeah, I mean, I think you're right, Tim. Like, you can kind of say, look, this is not what politics it's not how politics should be, but in terms of politics as people want it to be, like, I imagine they're hitting the sweet spot. I don't think they would be repeating the stuff ad nauseum if they didn't have a sense that this is what voters were turned on by, what they wanted to hear.
One thing that surprised me actually about it all was, the Green Party has got a massive whack with this in terms of, things they actually had being progressed in government, and now I guess it gives them a massive campaign launch, really, of like, this is all the stuff that we thought we were doing and it's not happening now, so vote for the Greens if you actually want some of this stuff to be done. But in saying that, I mean, Chris Hipkins spoke to the Green Party co-leaders on Monday morning before it had even, officially gone to Cabinet, so to speak, and they had all day to work out what their messaging was going to be around the fact that the government has decided that actually the climate crisis doesn't really matter anymore and we're all about the cost of living crisis. And I don't know what you guys think, but the press release and the commentary that came out of that from the Greens, I thought was so weak and so softly.
It was muted, Joe. It looked like, I think I said in a tweet that it was they were more issuing it in disappointment than in anger. It was very kind of tame until some of the individual MPs leapt up and made an issue of it, yeah.
Why do you think that was, Tim? Because, I mean, you talked about the fact that it's convenient for Labour to tack towards the centre. Surely it would be very convenient for the Greens to go very hard on the left. So why, I don't know, what's the strategy there, do you reckon?
I don't know. And I thought that once Golriz Ghahraman and some others started getting stronger about it, that looked more like what the Greens should be doing between now and October. Not sure why the leaders hedged like that.
It's funny you talk about Golriz because after I wrote that piece about how cynical and depressing it all was and that, now it's just this race to get the middle vote and do nothing and that Labor's now taken over from National as the party of doing nothing. Golriz, Green MP, liked and retweeted my piece about that. Yet they didn't seem to actually come out and say any of that themselves, but they were obviously agreeing with the message that was being sent. So,
the whole point of this agreement that they had with Labour after the 2020 election was Labour didn't need them and the Greens didn't need to give their support to Labour, but it was meant to be like we can speak out about almost anything we want, and they just haven't used it. It's kind of like, if your point is, and this is what their supporters keep saying, we need you to be more outspoken, we need you to push the government, we don't want you to just kind of be in there for the sake of being in there, but it really hasn't translated into anything.
Yeah.
Joe, can I ask you two, who are the kind of kitchen cabinet now with Hipkins? Who are the people sitting around with the pollsters and the Labour Party kind of campaign people making these sort of political calculations? We'll do this, that'll happen, we'll get a bit of vote from there, we'll do that, the Greens will react that way. There must be a little grouping. I don't know who they are now. Who are the key people?
I think the biggest change that you have seen is in the Chief of Staff. So you've had Raj Nana go, who was very much like Jacinda Ardern, and they'd worked together the whole time through that period. They were both very in the weeds, very concerned about what was in cabinet papers, far too tuned into the sort of various ins and outs of focus groups and polling. Who you've seen come in to replace Raj is Andrew Curtin, who's been with the party for a long time, is good friends with Chris Hipkins, but is also like a real retail guy. Like, he's your guy who just goes, what is the mood of Auckland? What is the mood of regional New Zealand? And is pretty cutthroat and is pretty prepared to do whatever it takes to get them back into power. I mean, he was very influential in that 2017 campaign when we had that last-minute switch to Jacinda Ardern. And I think that a lot of this has been driven by that new team at the top of Andrew Curtin and Chris Hipkins. I think to a lesser extent, Grant Robertson, he was obviously very much in amongst it with Jacinda Ardern. I don't personally think that Chris Hipkins is using Grant Robertson as much of a soundboard as Jacinda Ardern did. Right. I think that Chris Hipkins is to a certain degree also just going with his own gut and not necessarily consulting on things either. And he's having a good run at the moment and getting things right. But that, the risk is that luck runs out if you're not checking in with other people. Cool. Well, I think that is probably a good summary of what happened there. So let's move on to the other topic we were going to discuss this week, which is Of course, Stuart Nash, who has exited the Police Minister portfolio, but does get to hold on to his economic development, forestry, oceans and fisheries portfolios. Now, just a bit of a refresher here. This is a situation where, for some bizarre reason, Stuart Nash decided to go on News Talk ZB this week and out himself as having breached the Cabinet manual. He had a conversation with the Police Commissioner, which he shouldn't have, which was basically urging the Police Commissioner to act in a particular way around a court case. Went and said that on live radio. Short story is that he got hit up by the media. He defended. He doubled down. Chris Hipkins was not at all impressed with that. Obviously, you wouldn't be if you'd just broken the Cabinet manual and gone on radio to boast about it. And so he supposedly resigned. I think it's safe to say he was probably equally pushed. And the big debate now seems to be around, well, if he doesn't understand how the Cabinet manual works, then how on earth does he keep all of the other portfolios? So, yeah, Sam, what's your read? Do you think that this is case closed, or do you think that Stuart Nash is still at risk of being gone?
Yeah. Oh, look, I think there's a very good case to remove him altogether. I mean, I wrote down the technical term because I want to get it right. I think he was as dumb as a rock, basically. This is fundamentally how the New Zealand political system works, and any sort of democratic system is you have separation of powers, you have independence of the police and of law authorities, and you also have independence, between the judiciary and the executive in this legislature. So the fact that we're six years into the Labour government, he's been a minister that whole time, and he still doesn't understand this. And he clearly didn't, because he got asked about this later in the morning after he'd gone on News Talk ZB. He had a bunch of reporters, and he said, I was just chewing the fat with a mate. I'm sorry, you can't have yarns with your mates when you are, in effect, their boss almost. So, well,
and the interesting point about all of that too is that part of his defence in that stand-up with media was, well, I wasn't the police minister at the time that I did it, as if it's okay to talk to the police commissioner about a judicial case if you're not the police minister, not worrying about the fact that you've got all of these other portfolios.
Yeah. It's just, I think it's judgment across the board, right? I mean, I'd be interested, Tim, in how you would compare it to, I guess, other similar scandals in the past. The comparison that's been made is Maurice Williamson, although I think that was a very different case because they had a more direct link to himself and the National Party. But what parallels do you see with other kind of resignations or scandals of the past?
Well, I was going to raise that one, but yes, it's different. It was that in that case, Maurice Williamson, a minister, not Minister of Police, same thing, approaching a local police commander, not the commissioner, his mate, to see whether they had sufficient information on a domestic violence charge against a wealthy Chinese backer for the National Party. So yes, very different in the sense that the charge is also something more disturbing, and the fact that he's a donor to National. But Williamson, Minister of Construction and Building, Customs, Land Information, Stats, lost them all. So it wasn't an issue of, well, we'll give you just a punishment of something that you'll feel like you'll miss and you'll be hurt by. It was, you've broken the Cabinet manual, plainly not the right thing to do, your judgment's wrong, and you're gone. And Key was very strong on that stuff. And I think that's where the comparison does fit, that here's a minister acting while a minister, not the Minister of Police, losing portfolios that aren't the Minister of Police. And I think that's something that's a real lesson for Hipkins.
I think one particularly comical development today is Mike Hoskins' Mike's Minute, where he's done the backstory to how this interview ended up being on ZB yesterday morning when Stuart Nash unintentionally ended his police minister career. And Mike Hosking has revealed that Stuart Nash actually texted him and asked if he could have an interview on the program, and had put himself forward for it. So well done. Well done.
And actually, the whole interview, really the rest of the interview was equally staggering. I mean, the police commissioner bit was the most egregious and clearly the part that got him sacked or asked to resign politely. But you also had him saying that the decision was, a terrible decision by the judge, terrible judgment, and the judges need to read the room. I'm not sure that's how legislation works, that you're meant to do vibes-based sentencing. But then also he had this sort of suggestion that what was the quote that, it starts with shoplifting and then you join a gang and before you know it, you're shipping meth. Like, I'm sorry, I would like to find one single case where someone has had shoplifting as a first offence and then joins some sort of meth trafficking syndicate. So it's just like, and that's his style, right? There is a little bit of verbal incontinence. He sort of spouts things off, and he's a populist, and he's very tough on crime, as I think that was his approach, as Luke Malpassett stuff and others have noted, and that's kind of what's done him in here.
Yeah. I mean, what do you make of that though, Tim? Because, the Porter Williams softly police minister approach was tried by Jacinda Ardern and failed spectacularly. And we saw, Chris Hipkins get brought in to kind of clean it up, and then Chris Hipkins becomes Prime Minister and decides to go back to the old model of the sort of bravado and the bluster and the sort of, man's man approach of Stuart Nash. What does that mean, I guess, for who Chris Hipkins might look to be the next police minister? Do you stay on that track? If so, how many other people are there in the caucus that could do that with that sort of profile? Or does he try something different?
Yeah, there's a difference between being, regarded and having some respect among the police. And you do need to be someone who I think has their kind of issues close. I think if you're too much of a hand wringer or a newbie, you won't have the respect of the police. So you need that. But there's a difference between that and someone who's a blowhard, which is what Nash is. And that's always going to get you in trouble one way or the other. And it has. The other hilarious thing, Joe, about the whole Hosking interview is that Hosking and Newstalk didn't know what they had and didn't make anything of it at all.
Hosking agreed with Nash, actually, in the interview.
Yeah, I listened back to it and he was...
Mike's minute that we forgot to put it on our news?
Yeah, Hosking just sort of went, okay, cool. Yeah, moving on to these other crime stats. It's like, I'm sorry. Yeah, baffling. But that's another matter, as you say.
All right. Well, let's get into a couple of reader questions from our Newsroom Pro subscribers. First up, we've had a poll this week. Unbelievable. I can't even think when that was. This week has been about 3 weeks and 3 days. TVNZ, the One News Kantar public poll was out Monday night. That situation was left with Labour, Greens and Te Pāti Māori being able to form a government. It was the first poll in a while where National and ACT, even with Te Pāti Māori, wouldn't be able to form a government. I think probably one of the more interesting things that's going on at the moment with the polls, though, is less around what's happening with that party stuff, because I think we can all agree it's pretty tight and it's moving around bit by bit. But where it gets way more interesting is the preferred PM, the favourability stuff. So what we had with this poll was for the preferred PM, we had Chris Hipkins up 4 to 27%, and we had Christopher Luxon dropping 5 to 17%. If you're Christopher Luxon and the people around him at the moment, Sam, how worried are you about this?
Yeah, I'd be fairly worried. Tough night for him as well, you'll remember. So he came down with COVID, tested positive that night, and then he gets his terrible poll result. So, look, I mean, I think they shouldn't panic too much yet. They are still in a pretty good position. You've got, 7 months to go until the election. Things will shift around a bit, but at the same time, the trend is not great. And he has the same problem that Simon Bridges had when he was leader, in that the party's popularity is quite far ahead of the leader's popularity, and that's not always an issue. You don't need to be sort of an Ardern-style figurehead, dragging your party across the line single-handedly, but there is an issue there, and the finding, I think it might have been a News Hub Read Research poll, I can't remember, one of them which looked at trust, and he had these sort of terrible ratings on trust, and I think that's kind of a fundamental part of politics. So,
do you think, though, Tim, that we've got a situation now where Christopher Luxon came in, there was all this disunity, the caucus was kind of all over the shop, and Chris Luxon's obviously done a really good job of kind of bringing everyone together. You don't have this sort of MPs willy-nilly every day going off, running to the media, kind of, bitching about other MPs behind their back, etc. So, Luxon's done a good job there, and because of that, the votes got up to sort of, the high 30s. Did it hit 40 at any point? Maybe not. High 30s anyway, so big increase. But now it just seems to be all about whether people like or know or understand or have any kind of idea of who Luxon is. and that's all that kind of matters anymore? Do you think that they're going to plateau and Luxon's either going to get them across the line or people are going to decide they don't like him? And because you've got this race for the centre at the moment with what you're seeing with Chris Hipkins, that it's basically going to come down to whether you like Chris Hipkins or Chris Luxon more. Is that where we're going to end up in October?
We could well. And this is the worry for National. And I was hearing just the other day that where it really, the rubber meets the road on this, is that a group of centre-right donors actively talking now about switching away from National to ACT for their what's going to be quite big money. And so for National and for the party sitting in behind, their concern becomes real. Poll numbers actually translate in some of these instances, and trust numbers and ratings of the main guy translate to where, these people are willing to go stick their money. And sticking their money to ACT probably doesn't help. And you get into the situation you got into last time with a very strong ACT and things falling away. So it's a concern more than just for, Chris Luxon's hard feelings, that people don't like him, or for his handlers try to say, if you knew him in person, if you met him one-to-one, you'd know he's a great guy. That sort of stuff's always there. But it's when it gets to this point, a few months out, and people with money who have a capacity to directly influence things are thinking twice.
What do you both think about the idea of a change of leader? Like the theory that well, you could argue that he may be an Andrew Little type, where yes, he's stabilised the party, as you say, he's kind of got everyone united, but just doesn't have the charisma to get across the line.
If you're going to run that line, though, you'd have to also be suggesting that Nicola Willis is Jacinda Ardern, and I do not think that follows through.
Yeah. Tim?
I don't think they have anyone in that ilk to be her to a Little figure. I don't think he's Andrew Little. I don't think he's exhausted his kind of possibilities of appeal or convincing people like Little had. It's an interesting phenomenon for them, how they sit around again in their kind of campaign kitchen cabinet and say, what do we do with you, Chris? It's not easy. They might come across something and he might develop a sort of a personality that we all want to sort of see more of. Has to, soon.
It's almost like the opposite of David Shearer, and I'm just thinking of this now, so this could come out terrible, but, David Shearer had so many people telling him what to do and what to be that he kind of tried to be all of those things and ended up just like it all just fell flat and he was terrible. Where with Luxon, I think he's just being himself, but himself is that corporate business sort of, he's not a guy who's sort of out and about at the pub at one with the people, sort of, that's not his style. He's the Kuru Lounge guy. He's the, black tie event guy. And that's just who he's being. And it's kind of the opposite of Shearer in the sense that rather than taking in all this, you need to do this, you need to be more empathetic, you need to be a better communicator, all of that. He's not taking any of that on board and he's just being who he is, and that's not working for him either.
Yeah, totally agree.
That's surprising, but good.
He's the business class in-flight manager who's having to go back and give out the lollies and doesn't quite know how to engage with the public.
Well, apparently he used to do that on the plane, so I don't think he's got that excuse. Allegedly he did, so just do that, Maybe literally hand out lollies, I don't know. Well, that might qualify as treating, though, and breach the Electoral Act, so we'll move on from that.
Okay. Just to wrap things up, here we've got our second reader question. Now, interesting sort of foreign policy space at the moment. Obviously, AUKUS developments, impacts on New Zealand. Sam, you're the expert here.
Yeah, directly not much in the short term, probably. We're looking at, it's crazy numbers, $400 billion, New Zealand, to build these nuclear-powered submarines for Australia over the next 30 years. It's 0.15% of Australia's GDP on average for the next 30 years. So this
is the US basically giving their submarine nuclear-powered sort of technology to Australia.
Yeah, the US and the UK. So it's going to be a hybrid vessel. So they will get some sort of...
Did I read it right that they're actually going to be second-hand submarines for Australia? In
the interim, so they have this problem where it's going to take, I think, 3 decades probably, at least 25 years or so until the first new ones come on stream. And without anything in the meantime, they'd have these very old, I think they're Collins submarines maybe, that are not great. So what's going to happen is the Americans are going to sell some of their second-hand but nuclear-powered high-spec ones to sort of plug that gap. And then when they have these new custom-built ones that come on, then I think Australia will still keep them. But yeah, I mean, I guess to go back to the ramifications for New Zealand, as I say, huge defence spending by Australia on this, and I think they're increasing across the board. We've seen the Japanese government, South Korean government, so many countries boosting their defence budgets. I think there are going to be a lot of people looking at New Zealand and saying, well, what are you guys bringing to the table? Are you sort of free riding here if you expect us to look after you if something happens? What are you going to do for yourselves? What are you doing to help us? So there might be some more pressure on to increase the spend there. The other thing is, I guess, that it's not going to help tensions. It might not make them much worse, but it's not going to lead to things cooling down between the US and China. And having nuclear-powered submarines, I should say, not nuclear-armed, which is an important distinction, having them stationed in Australia maybe makes Australia more of a target, and by proxy brings things closer to us. So
another threat. Great. That's what we need.
Great time to be alive, basically.
Yeah. I don't know. What do you make, Tim? I mean, the sort of overwhelming message from Chris Hipkins this week in response to it is basically being, well, we have our nuclear-free policy, we wouldn't tolerate having these ships in our water, etc. But then kind of pushed to answer any questions more broadly around it. He's leapt to that phrase that all prime ministers love to rely on, which is, oh, well, that's a hypothetical. Is Chris Hipkins biding his time to see what sort of happens here? Is it increasingly, I guess, a tricky space for us because of the threat, particularly in the Indo-Pacific, and how as a country we're going to respond to that?
Yeah, first thing, I think we should reclaim the justification of hypotheticals. Hypotheticals should be our stock and trade, and should be academics and politicians' stock and trade. If you're not thinking forward and doing scenarios of what happens if this happens, then it's not very good planning, and that applies beyond foreign affairs into economics and everything else as well. But yeah, you're right, Joe. The question here will be, what do we end up doing that resists or contributes to the ultimate tension Sam's talking about with China and America? If we are just sitting there like a ping pong ball on a high sea, will be no use to anybody. And so we're going to have to make some better, sort of clearer commitment to where we're going to be on this. And it'll have to be. It's one of these things. It's a bit like with the resurgence in inflation and interest rates. We've got a pandemic, all these things back from the past coming to haunt us. One of them now will be the ANZUS, nuclear-free, New Zealand sort of independent military/foreign policy. I think there'll be pressure to roll some of that back, and it won't be over the next year, but over the next decade or so,
Well, isn't it good, though, that we're now in a climate is the nuclear-free moment, not nuclear, but also that's not really in it either because we're actually in a cost of living crisis. So we're actually just moving on from all of it. Right. Speaking of moving on, let's wrap things up now with something that we have watched, read or listened to this week that we think that you guys out there should also watch, listen or read. Tim, what have you been up to?
Yeah, I'm going to recommend a column in the New York Times by Paul Krugman, the economics professor and ex-Nobel laureate, about the Silicon Valley Bank bailout. The title of it was How Bad Really Is the Silicon Valley Bailout? And it examines an issue, I think, which is really important, wider than just the banking, which is moral hazard, which is basically, if you say to someone, even if you put your money in a bank you haven't checked out, you're not sure if it's safe and secure, if it falls over, we'll still, as a government, pay your money back. But the flip side of that is, as a bank, even if we behave recklessly and not carefully, we will be bailed out as well. So the moral hazard is that because the government's always going to be there behind you, and there'll always be a bailout, you will take risks and you won't be careful. He looks at this and applies it beyond that to things political and general and policies that you keep saying doesn't matter what happens. Basically, the central and the state will come in behind you. You're going to get poor decisions and poor reckonings. It's a really fascinating piece. One line just to recommend, because it applies again politically. He said that, everyone thought the system would survive this, but they decided on the bailout because it was less risky politically to overreact than it was risky politically to underreact. And I think that's a real thing that politicians and schemers always keep thinking of.
Yeah. Sam?
I will plug the work of our esteemed colleague, Mark Dauder.
Oh, I thought you were going to say me. Now I'm disappointed.
No. You're not esteemed. Self-professed climate nerd Mark Dauder, who's written a very good piece this week around where this government money that's now been cut from all these climate programs, where it will go, because that is ring-fenced. It can't just be thrown wherever you want into bread and butter. So it has to go to climate. I know. I only use it sarcastically. Into the climate space. So, what are the options there, and what sort of policies could you look at that might help with both emissions and the cost of living? So, I think it's a really good piece and lays out these issues quite well.
Well, just to wrap things up, I actually really enjoyed Stuff's political editor Luke Malpass's piece on Stuart Nash no longer being the police minister. It was a very comical, sort of colourful, fun comment piece, just laying out sort of the approach that Stuart Nash took to being police minister, which he described as big dick politics. He managed to get that mention in both the intro and the outro, and just had some really great colourful analysis in between. So yeah, definitely recommend checking that out.
I like
as well.
the introduction of suns out, guns out for Nash. That kind of struck my stuff. Yeah.
It was good. It was a good read. So that's it for Raw Politics for this week. Thank you to Hugo Stewart for helping us sound and look better. Anyone who wants a question answered, please do send them to me at jo.moyer@newsroom.co.nz by the end of play Wednesday so that we can answer your questions for you. Thank you, Sam and Tim, again for your wonderful contributions.
Cheers.
And you can find us next week, same time, same place, here on YouTube.